Everybody. As people come in, it is 3:30 right now. As I say, every Friday around this time, the door to the Zoom webinar for some reason is a single file door. So people are sort of filtering in at the moment. And of course, we're going to have a couple of people show up a couple minutes late. So hang tight and we'll get started around 3:33. All right, it's 3:33, so I might as well get us started here. We'll probably have some more people show up, but you all didn't show up to hear me talk. You showed up for the panel. So I'll do opening commentary and we'll get rolling. So hello, and welcome to the Smart, Equitable Commonwealth, co-creating the society we want. My name is Dan O'Brien, and I'm the director of the Boston Area Research Initiative. And this is the 12th week of our conference. And this week's panel is on two Bostons. Now, before I get to the panel at hand, I just want to provide a few quick reminders. The podcasts for our first 11 panels are now available through Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, or SoundCloud. This is also where you'll find all future podcasts. There are two more to go, as I'll note in a moment. They're released each Friday, so be sure to subscribe. Speaking of those two more to go, really three if you include today's, but we have two more panels after this one. Next week is on pollution. It'll be our last, what we're thinking of as topical panels. And then our final panel on July 31st will be a closing keynote. It will feature the mayors of Boston, Framingham, and Lawrence, and the town manager of Danvers. There will be also the executive director of the MAPC, Mark Drayson, will speak. And it'll all be moderated by Cindy Espinosa, the Director of Philanthropy and Civic Engagement for Microsoft. So a really exciting conversation to wrap us up on the theme of what do cities and towns need now? And importantly, I think a real call to action to this community of the kinds of things that those who are dedicated to research and policy and the confluence of the two can offer. Last announcement, just a reminder, we have taken a break from the happy hour for now. There will be no happy hour this week or next week. It seems that with nicer weather, people have other things they want to do from 4:30 to 5:30, which is fantastic. But we will bring it back for the last week and have it as a sort of conference reception, as it were, on the 31st. So to today and today's conversation, two Bostons, a conversation that I feel like we've been having for weeks, but we've also been having it for decades, depending on whether you define it as the civil rights movement of the 1960s or to the 1920s and the Jim Crow debates, or back to the Civil War and abolition and before. Basically, even today, right, white Bostonians and Black and brown Bostonians, rich Bostonians and poor Bostonians have extremely different experiences of the city on every dimension. Right, this was highlighted again early last month following the death of George Floyd. And I'm glad to note that the BARI conference was originally designed to explore these themes, and we continue to do so both before and since that event. And I feel that that speaks to the commitment of this broader community to equity and justice, to populate our agenda with this content, because we don't make the agenda entirely ourselves. The coordinating team, it comes from the proposals that are sent in from speakers. And this is fantastic because this needs to be a continuous conversation, not something that's just happening as an ephemeral response to a high profile tragedy. So today we get the privilege of being able to focus entirely on this challenge that faces our city and faces cities across the country. We're certainly not alone in this. Now, that conversation is no trivial task. And quite frankly, I believe our moderator is the best person we have available for the job, to lead that conversation today, and to help the speakers work through it. And that is Ted Landsmark, my colleague from Northeastern University. And it's my job to introduce Ted. He's asked me to do so briefly, which I'm going to try to oblige him. But I am going to tell an anecdote that he's probably going to chide me later for sharing. But I think it captures the gravitas that Ted brings to this. A few months ago, he shared with me that he was at an event back when we all went to physical events, and he introduced himself to a young woman who then paused with wide eyes and looked at him and said, "Wait, the Ted Landsmark?" And so I think that essentially gets at the idea that Ted has been part of the fabric of the city for a very long time, ever since distinguishing himself as a civil rights leader in the mid 70s as a local lawyer. And since then, he's really constructed a legacy that spans dozens of Boston's institutions. He has been not only a lawyer, but faculty at 7 universities, if I have my count correct. He may correct me later. President of Boston Architectural College. He has sat or still sits on numerous boards, including the BPDA, the MFA, the BPS, and others over the years. And today he is the director of the Dukakis Center at Northeastern University. So Ted's influence in thinking about civil rights and about the ways that white and black Bostonians, rich and poor Bostonians all experience the city differently, the history speaks for itself. And so I trust nobody more with leading us through this conversation. And with that, I'm going to stop speaking and I'm going to let him take over. Thank you, Ted.
Well, thanks, Dan. You're very kind. And I will say that any of those introductions kind of place a premium on things that I've done in the past, and that's well and good, and I'm happy with that. But all of our conversations now really need to focus on what we need to be doing as we move forward. I'm reminded in this period of national crisis that 5 months from now, there will be a new agenda in place in Washington. And by that, I mean that if the incumbent is reelected, any person going into a second term where you can't be reelected then begins to carry out all of the things that you couldn't get to in the first term. And what that means is that anything that is pent up will be unleashed. If, on the other hand, the incumbent is not reelected, a whole new group of policymakers will be in Washington setting new agendas around urban planning, around policy, around race, around economic justice, so that whatever happens in November, it's quite clear that come January, the nation is going to be on a somewhat different course than it is at this moment. And the conversations that we're having are conversations about establishing what that new agenda is going to be. Now, when you and I first started talking about Two Bostons, we talked about it, I think, initially in terms of a Black Boston and a white Boston, or a people of color Boston and a white Boston. But Two Bostons can mean a lot more than that these days. It means a Boston of individuals who feel that they are protected by the police as opposed to those who are abused by the police. We recently learned that Boston is the third fastest gentrifying city in the United States after San Francisco and Denver. What does that mean in terms of there being multiple Bostons? Are we referring to the Boston of people who are educated and entitled, or the Boston of those individuals who come in after and clean offices and who've been on the front lines of the health crisis that COVID has brought us? So we're very fortunate today in having 4 speakers, 2 of whom work with the city of Boston and 2 of whom are researchers at MIT, to talk about various aspects of what Boston is, and also about how one uses data to move Boston forward to what it could be and what it needs to be. So our first speaker is our long-term colleague, Jason Ewis, who will speak on financial well-being. And Jason works with the city of Boston on a number of issues. So let me turn this over to Jason and let's have at it.
Sure, thank you so much for that intro, and excited to be a part of the discussion. I'll start off by saying that I did recently switch jobs. I still work with the city in a few capacities, but I currently work at an organization called Commonwealth, which is a mission-driven organization that focuses on delivering research and action around financial security. But the work that I'll be presenting on today, I did while I was director of the Economic Mobility Lab. And this is a sort of a strange webinar for me because I'll be inhabiting that old space. So I'll use some of the same terms that I did. So this project was done while I was at the Economic Mobility Lab, which is an innovation team that's in the mayor's office of the city of Boston. It still currently exists. You can look them up. They're a great team still. And I'll be focusing on some research that we did around the financial well-being of Bostonians in collaboration with the Beacon Survey, which is an initiative of the Center for Survey Research at UMass Boston. And the goal, I'll get the presentation up in a second here, but the goal of that was really to understand at a nuanced Boston-specific level how the disparities played out on the ground in order to inform solutions, right? So we understand that there are these enormous inequities by race, by gender, and economic inequities in the city of Boston. But the survey is really trying to get down to the specific levels so that we can design programs and policies from a city perspective that allow us to effectively address them. So that's the sort of the towards action is the goal, and I will get that presentation up here. So I'll review what the Beacon survey is briefly, what we think we can get out of it, where the collaboration with the city has gone, and where I think it could go moving forward. Again, it's a unique position where I help lead this work, and I'll thank all of the people who put it together, but I will not be the one moving this forward at the city. So we can connect you to the right folks afterwards. So the Beacon survey is a probability-based panel survey of Boston residents. They've done one full wave, which was conducted in early 2019. The research that I'll show was finished almost exactly a year ago. A lot has changed in the world. Some hasn't, right? But some things have not changed, but a lot has. And I'll address that throughout. You'll see here the basic numbers. The end was 300 respondents. The one thing that I'll note is our survey at the Economic Mobility Lab that focuses on advancing the well-being and working with low to moderate income folks. So we'll refer to low income respondents, which is roughly 300% of the federal poverty line or below. So that number varies based on household size, and we can send the methodology out afterwards, but the end for low income was about 180. So they're underrepresented, and that's something that Beacon is working and has worked to improve. And high income is above that. So they're just sort of markers of convenience there, but that's what we mean by low income and high income in this survey. And I mentioned this earlier, but just to reiterate, there are, anybody familiar with the space knows the depth of these inequities historically. You look at the racial wealth gap, but the goal here was to add to that knowledge in some very specific ways. And again, with the goal of informing action. So it's Boston specific data. So there are some questions that we ask here for which we have national information, or in some cases regional information. but not Boston specific information. And, you know, Boston, I still live there. Boston's a special place, right? In some great ways and in some ways that we could improve. So we wanted some really Boston specific information. And with future iterations of the survey, hopefully we can track individual level data over time. So it's not snapshots of different people. We can see trends over time with individuals. And again, hopefully the survey builds out. So this really is offering a baseline. Again, I probably should have mentioned this in the presentation, but there's nothing super revelatory in here, right? We understand the inequities, but it provides a good baseline and some nuanced information. So I'll quickly run through in 3 or 4 minutes some of the key takeaways. This partnership was the city and the Economic Mobility Lab worked with Beacon to incorporate some specific financial well-being related questions. So these weren't going to be in the survey necessarily. We partnered with them to get these to inform city programs and policy. So around banking access, unsurprisingly, there was a difference between low and higher income people with access to checking and savings accounts. What really stood out was that 22% of low income respondents lacked a savings account or a checking account. And as we learned with the COVID-19 $1,200 payments, the payment system is critical, and having a checking or savings account meant getting your payment more quickly, and in some cases getting the full payment with different fees, right? So this is a critical issue that you know, we have not solved, and that helped inform the revamp of the Bank on Boston program, which I worked on before I switched over. But this research did help inform that, and that because we didn't have Boston specific data, right? So so this was a key finding there. And I'll run through these super quickly because there's a lot of content to get to. But you'll see here that in particular, Black low-income respondents were much more likely than others to use a payday loan or check cashing service. And so that mostly tracks with national data, but that's from our understanding slightly higher. And I know there are a million questions on these. There's a lot of information. There's a difference with foreign-born and native-born folks around access to a checking account, which makes sense given some of the rules around that. And then unsurprisingly, a sort of big finding was that people with kids, particularly households headed by single parents and single mothers, had more financial well-being challenges. You know, kids are expensive. We didn't, again, we didn't need the survey, but you'll see through these slides, there's a nuance to the specific barriers that they face, and also some of the strengths that they can bring. So on savings, so this is where a lot of my current work is around, the famous, you know, significant percentage of Americans would have trouble accessing $400 in a crisis. We find that's true in Boston, particularly for low to moderate income folks. So 48% say they have less than $500 in liquid cash for an emergency. So that was an area where there's only national level data on that. So we recognize it's a problem in Boston, and that it's really concentrated on LMI folks, which is not totally surprising, but you know, there's a nuance there that we didn't have before. Some of this is reiterating the gender and the race and ethnicity disparities that exist. To go into those would take a long time. Happy to do that. And just to go through bill payments, low-income folks have a harder time paying their bills and often will skip payments. And it breaks down along the similar lines. Debt, they're more likely to carry monthly credit card balances. And the last one I'll mention is on retirement. With all the talk with COVID-19 of people potentially accessing their retirement accounts, this really adds a nuance to the conversation, and a Boston-specific nuance, that less than half of low-income respondents have retirement accounts. All right, so there was a lot of discussion about people rating their retirement accounts to weather COVID-19. People didn't have emergency savings, and many didn't have at least a formal retirement account. And that breakdown was, and even among low-income respondents, so this is where you really see the race and ethnicity disparities. White low-income folks were much more likely than Black and Latino low-income folks, and Asian ones as well, to have a retirement account. So there's something systemic there, right? Because most people's retirement accounts are from their employer. So there's an issue of employers aren't offering these accounts in the same way, there aren't the same benefits for ultimately similar jobs if they're being paid about the same. So this is a national issue, but that really stood out in the data as something worth investigating and exploring. We again see the breakdown with foreign-born, and that is some wonky data that I definitely don't have time to get into. So that was, the key thing is that this will continue. We'll get information from these same folks and be able to inform in a really practical, tangible way city programs and policies over time as we work to, to build a more equitable policy.
Well, thank you. That is highly disturbing data. We know that economic status also has a lot to do with how one is treated within the context of the criminal justice system. So let's go to Jonna Murphy, who is with the Boston Health Commission for data that she and her colleagues have been working on. Jonna?
Jonna, you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So I am presenting today on an analytical study that's using the Boston Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, or BREFIS, which is a population-based health survey, which we use to examine the impact of racially biased police stops on mental health, specifically anxiety and sadness. I want to acknowledge that the study was started in 2015 and it was accepted to BARI months ago. And since then, I think how society considers racism has changed some. Of particular importance, racism has been declared a public health crisis in Boston. And I think that this was much needed because we know that people of color face inequities in many health outcomes. And this includes, but isn't limited to, chronic disease, mental health outcomes, maternal health outcomes, and most recently, COVID-19. And it's important to acknowledge that these inequities have existed for a very long time, and even if they are now receiving more attention. My team at Boston Public Health Commission has historically spent a lot of time understanding how these inequities present in Boston. And one thing we know is that these inequities are not caused by biological differences, but by racism. And we can define racism in different ways. It can include interpersonal, internalized, and institutional, and also structural. And structural racism includes negative interactions with law enforcement. So the purpose of this study was not to measure how many police stops actually happened, but rather we were looking for a marker or a way really to quantify structural racism as best we could. The American Public Health Association acknowledges that violence that is structurally mediated by law enforcement system disproportionately causes death, injury, trauma, and poor mental health comes among people of color. And similar studies have been done in Chicago and New York that indicate that men of color who experience more racially biased police stops had more trauma. So our objectives, knowing this, were to describe the demographic and socially determinant characteristics of Boston adult residents who we reported experiencing racially profiled police stops, and to examine if experience of racially profiled police stops is associated with persistent sadness and persistent anxiety in the Boston adult population. To do this, we used the Boston Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. I'm having a little technical difficulty here. The Boston Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System is often known as BREFIS. Some of you might be familiar with the CDC's BREFIS, which is a nationwide survey designed to measure health outcomes and behavior. Here in Boston, the Boston Public Health Commission independently conducts our own BREFIS, which is modeled after the CDC's BREFIS, which means we essentially use their gold standard of methodology and ask a lot of the same questions, but are able to tailor it and add questions that might be of interest or relevant to Boston residents specifically. In addition, conducting our own survey allows us to get a large sample of Boston residents, roughly 3,000 respondents. Responses are then weighted to reflect the Boston population. The BREFIS is conducted in English and in Spanish and is done over landline and SAL. So to measure racially biased police stops, we asked a question that originated in a Gallup poll. Have you ever felt you're stopped by the police just because of your race or ethnic background? To measure sadness and anxiety, we asked, during the past 30 days, for about how many days have you felt worried, tense, or anxious? And during the past 30 days, how many days have you felt sad, blue, or depressed? Those who answered 15 or more days were considered to have persistent sadness and anxiety. So this indicates that they felt sad or anxious more than half of the time. And these questions are also used on the CDC preface to measure mental health. All the data we collect is weighted to reflect the Boston adult population. We used multivariate logistic regression to model mental health as a function of racially profiled police stops. We were then able to control for year, age, sex, race, ethnicity, education, household income, housing status, and those who experienced one or more adverse childhood experiences. Afterwards, we obtained an odds ratio. Now I'll present the results. It's of no real surprise that we found that 30% of Black residents reported experiencing a racially biased police stop, compared to 3% of white residents. So that's 10 times the percentage. Latinx residents also had higher percentages than white residents, with 14%, and men had higher percentages than women. But when we look at the results by race and gender, we found that 46% of Black men reported a racially profiled police stop. So that's almost 1 in 2. So this is to say that although our study modeled mental health outcomes as a function of this experience regardless of race, we know that this is a problem that mostly impacts our residents of color. We also found that residents of lower income and education, unemployed residents, residents living in subsidized housing, and residents who had experienced adverse childhood experiences reported higher percentages. So how does this affect mental health? If we minimally adjust, how does this affect mental health? If we minimally adjust for year, age, sex, and race ethnicity, the odds of persistent sadness and anxiety is more than 2-fold higher for Boston adult residents who reported racially profiled police stops compared to Boston adult residents who did not. And the odds ratios are 2.6 for sadness and 2.4 for anxiety. When we additionally adjusted for education, income, employment, housing, and the adverse childhood experiences, the associations reduced but still remain strongly significant, with the odds being 70% higher for adult residents who reported racially profiled police stops compared to adult residents who did not. And this was true for both sadness and anxiety. So some strengths for the study include the fact that Breathless has a very large sample and it's weighted so it can be generalizable to non-institutionalized households of adult residents. We're also able to control for a lot of factors that I mentioned. But some weaknesses of the study include that we weren't able to control for everything. And also it is survey data, so it's self-report. It's one directional, so we can't determine if the mental health indicators were there before or after the police stop. And we don't know if those with poor mental health outcomes might have been more likely to report such an experience. There's a limited scope of the question, so we don't know how, when, or where the stop occurred, and we don't know if it was recent or in Boston. We also don't know how many times this experience has happened, which is important because other studies have shown that those who experience these stops more frequently had worse mental health outcomes. The preface also doesn't reach institutionalized populations, so that would include those in prison and also those in other institutions. And it doesn't include folks that aren't living in households, so that would include the homeless. We also know that marginalized people are less likely to respond to the preface, so we suspect that this effect could be even greater. But in conclusion, we know that racially profiled police stops were strongly associated with persistent sadness and anxiety in this sample of adult residents, and that this largely impacted people of color. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Let's move to Esteban Mora, who is at MIT and who's been working on issues of invisibility. Esteban?
Okay, I think you can see my screen and you can hear me. Thank you. I'm not going to talk about the superpower of invisibility. I'm going to talk about something that we have been doing, a project that we have started. I'm going to show preliminary results about the project that we have been doing at MIT Connection Sign, IDSS, which is about detecting invisible borders in our cities using high precise mobility data from mobile phone data. So one of the things that probably you are aware of is that if we want to create resilient cities and if we want to create equitable resilient cities in the future, we need to tackle the problems that our cities have today. And you can pick your report, the one that you like, and I'm bringing here the report done by the European Commission, which is called The Future of Cities, in which they mention many different problems, like, for example, labor market, of course, epidemics, what is happening today, mobility, environmental impact agents, etc. One of the things that we do at MIT is that we believe that most of these problems have to do with places, which is a traditional way to actually think about these problems, thinking about buildings, parks, streets, neighborhoods, etc. But the piece that we add is basically we believe that these problems have to do more with behavior. I mean, the fact that we move around the cities and the fact that we, I don't know, commute miles to go to our workplaces, and the fact that we go to the entertainment districts tell us probably something more about what is happening in the city than what we are at 3 a.m. in the morning. And I'm saying this because when you talk about segregation, for example, in the Boston area, you are a polygon. So most of the policies tells you that basically we are what we are at 3 a.m. in the morning. And people go to the census, and if you live, for example, in Brookline, and then you say, well, do you are of specific, let's say, demographics. So basically, this is what you have. You have polygons and static pictures of what is happening in the city. But let me tell you something that we found in our data. In our data, we found that around 75% of the people that you encounter or interact every day lives more than 15 kilometers away from you. That means that if you are going to be segregated, isolated, or you're going to have problems trying to find social capital in your neighborhood, or you're going to have problems, for example, in pandemic, for example, what we are having right now, the chances are that what is happening to you is happening far away from your neighborhood. Actually, that number is even closer with your census block, meaning that only 3% of your interactions happen with the neighbors that live in the same block that you live. So something is happening in our cities, which is far away from those polygons that I was talking about, and for that static picture of the city. The first thing that we did in our group was to actually have a look at it and see if there is segregation happening, if there is isolation happening in our cities. It has to be happening in places, not in neighborhoods. And then we map all the places in the Boston area. Sorry, this is the map for New York, but you can also find the map of Boston. We have around 300,000 places in the Boston area, and we mapped inequality at the level of places. So given a single place, we can tell you what is the income profile of the people that are visiting that place. So we can talk about segregation happening within those specific places. You can have, this is the web page, you can navigate your neighborhood, or you can navigate your favorite places and see how segregated they are. So this is telling you that, of course, census data and demographics by those polygons are still important, but there's a lot that we are missing just by looking at the census data. But today I'm going to talk about another aspect that we are investigating using this mobility data, which is invisible borders. And there are many visible and invisible borders in our cities. And probably most of the visible borders in the Boston area, you might tell by heart, probably like the Charles River or the Muddy River or the tunnels between the airport and the north end and the city center, etc. You know that there are highways, river walls, etc., which are visible, and there are two borders in our cities. I'm bringing here the picture of something that probably the people in Philadelphia does know, which is the Chinese Wall. This is the famous railroad station of Broad Street, and it was called the Chinese Wall because the chances that you went through the rail station to the other side of the Chinese Wall were zero. So that was something that was dividing the city for a long time until it was demolished in the 50s. And I'm going to bring another picture of one of the famous Chinese walls that we have in our city in Boston. A lot of actually people have been studying this problem of other not so visible borders that we have in our cities. These are Jane Jacobs called them border vacuums, and there are, for example, even parks. Parks can be places in which people get together, but can also be deterrents of going through them, and can separate areas, and what Jane Jacobs said, can suck the life of our city and its neighborhoods. So just a park, or for example, or a building can act as a border vacuum. But of course, there are all the invisible borders that exist because of segregation. I mean, there are, most of us probably know about this in Boston, because Boston is one of the most segregated areas in the United States, in which there are neighborhoods which are mostly African-American, mostly poor neighborhoods, mostly low education attainment neighborhoods, which are really next to high educational attainment areas, high income, etc. Okay. For example, one of the border vacuums that we have in our city is the government center. The government center, actually the park which is around the government center, is one of the places that was supposed to actually put together people, but it's actually one of the deterrents of the mobility in the area. And I'm not going to mention this because there's a huge literature about what is the impact of borders in our cities, whether they are visible or invisible, or obvious or not so obvious. Those borders prevent social interactions, promote vacancy, they promote urban decay. The fact that people don't go through an area can actually be an indication of crime or other kind of problems, etc. And in general, these borders constrain the social and economic development of neighborhoods. So for us, it's paramount to detect where are these urban borders, if there are any borders in the city, where are they, and the reason why they are created in our city. So I'm going to actually define borders in the city in a very functional way. So a border in a city is a place in which people never go through. Okay, so this is a very simple functional way of defining a border. So you imagine that you have two areas, and there's a flow of people from area A to B, like on the left. But there's another situation, like the one on the right, in which the number of people going through that, let's say, border is very small. And I would say anomalously small. Okay, I will say that in a minute. So this is what we have been doing. We have traces of about 300,000 people in the Boston area, and we have the traces of these people moving around the city, so we can identify where are the places in which people never cross those borders. And the reason is try to understand why these borders are there, and what are these borders, and the reason why these borders are there. Okay. But when we say about anomalous, what I mean by anomalous is that, of course, if there's nobody in the area, there's nobody crossing the border. Okay, so we are actually have to normalize by the number of people, the expected number of people that are going to go through that particular area. Okay, so we are using many different mobility models. The one that we're bringing here is the gravity model. That's an estimation of how many people are going to go from area A to area B, and we're going to use this gravity model as a null model for estimating what is the expected flow of people between these areas. We have considered many different areas, and you can see here in the plot that you see, we have considered census block groups, and the borders are going to be let's say the borders between the polygons that define the block groups. Okay, so the first question is, where are the borders? And this is actually a platform that we are building, and these are the borders that our algorithm detects. Some of them are super obvious, like for example, the Charles River. I mean, there are not many people crossing the Charles River and once again, this is relative to the null model. There are other borders, for example, that are also obvious, like for example, the Muddy River that separates Brookline from actually Roxbury. There's another one, for example, which is the separation between the East Boston and the North Boston. But also you can see that some of them are related. For example, there's another one which you can clearly see here, which is the South Station. Around the South Station, you have another border, and also around the Fenway area, you have many borders. But I don't know if you noticed, but there's many borders that happen in residential areas. Even within the same residential area, you can have people that are living back to back in the same street, which never actually go from one side of the street to the other side of the street. Okay, so not every natural border or not every invisible border in the area relates to, sorry, not every border relates to a visible border. Some of them relates to invisible borders. Okay, so this is where, I mean, and this is fine. We have found the borders in the Boston area. By the way, we have the borders in the 11 cities in the United States, including New York, Seattle, Chicago, etc. And this is going to be in our platform probably along the summer. But the question is why? Why we have those borders in the first place? Why there's this anomalous flow of people going from one area to the other, which prevents probably communication between the people living in those two areas, interactions, I don't know, or it could be probably a transportation issue. So what we have done is to investigate what is happening around the border. And what we did was, the first one is to investigate what Jane Jacobs says, whether this border is a border vacuum. There are highways, parks, bus trains, no POIs, no points of interest there. The other one is what Shelley was saying. Maybe the differences between the people living in both sides of the area in terms of demographics is so high that there's no points of contact. There's nothing that can actually, they're sharing in terms of employment, in terms of interest, etc. And the other one is what Grannis was saying, is that there might not be even a road to go from one to another, or the building age of the ownership, the type of ownership between the different areas, it's so large that there's nothing actually to, there's no interest from one people on one area to go to the other. What we found is actually that Jane Jacobs does not apply to the Boston area. Doesn't mean that that's not applied to other areas, but Jane Jacobs actually does not. Most of the borders that we found actually happen in areas of, at least this, what you can see here is the plot that tells the average difference of the average of the variable for between areas that have a border and areas that do not have a border. Okay, and what you can see here is that areas that have no border have more supposed to be border vacuums as Jane Jacobs. I have to say that in other cities this does apply, like for example Chicago, but in Boston we found the opposite. But in terms of demography, Schelling was right. I mean, there is a lot of borders which have to do with differences, for example, in the percentage of Latino or white population. Okay? So across a border, you can always find more difference in the fraction of white, African American, or Latino than across between areas we do not share a border. But the main factor that defines a border in the Boston area is the housing value. Most of the borders that we identify in the Boston area has to do with differences in the housing value. Okay, even for example, places which are just across the street, one is an apartment building and the other one are very small multifamiliar houses. There's nobody crossing the street. Okay, and those are actually borders which are very easy to cross, but people are not making that. The other thing which is obvious is that there's a lot of differences in having amenities in the border. So if the border is surrounded by amenities, there's a lot of people crossing, and there's if the border doesn't have amenities, there's no people crossing that. Okay, so Shelley was right and Brandon was right. At least in Boston, the Jacobs effect is not seen. In general, this is average. Obviously, you can also find an example in which it is worked. The other thing that we have is that we have identified, I think Ted mentioned in the introduction, that Boston is the third most gentrified area in the city center, in the United States. And what we can see, for example, is that by looking in the 2 different years, what has happened in the last 2 years is that the borders have been strengthened in the Boston area. They have become stronger. There are no more borders, but the borders that were there have become stronger. There are some of them, for example, like the surrounding gentrification areas, like the one in Fenway and the one in the south of Boston, which has become stronger. Okay, they have been more and more borders there, and the borders are actually, we have a border index which measures how strong is the effect of the border in the flow of people. They have become stronger. So this is what we have. These are the preliminary results that we have. What we have seen is that most of the invisible borders in the Boston area do not have to do with rivers, do not have to do with infrastructure. They are happening within communities, and the reason is because there are demographic differences and building difference that actually transform into borders. Border vacuums, not so much. What we have seen is that in the last 2 years, the borders have become stronger. There are no more of them, but they have become stronger. And obviously, the future work would have to do is to try to see what is the effect of this. What is the effect of gentrification in this creation of borders, but what is the effect of these borders also on segregation and neighborhood. I have big news for everybody that is interested in this data, is because we are going to create a website and we are going to open this data. So you will be able to work with the flows of people moving from different areas in the Boston. So hopefully you will be able to create your own maps on your own investigations about how people move around. Thank you.
Thank you, Esteban. Let us move to Madeline Diop, who is also at MIT and who's been doing work on neighborhood mobility. Madeline?
Great, thank you. So let's see. Thank you all for having me today. I really appreciate it. In contrast with Esteban, I'm actually going to talk not so much about how people move physically, but how they move residentially, so how they change addresses. And the fundamental question driving my research is, can residential mobility help local stakeholders understand which communities are likely to share housing and health challenges? It won't surprise you, I hope, that the answer is yes, but more specifically, there are three key insights that I want to talk about today. So first, I'll show how sending and receiving patterns differ even for adjacent communities, and I'll use some qualitative data to explain why that might be. Then I'll show you a little bit about how communities of neighborhoods detected empirically in this data set align with existing regional planning agency boundaries for socioeconomically advantaged movers, but not for disadvantaged movers. This work is conducted in collaboration with the Healthy Neighborhood Study Consortium, a network of institutional and community partners who've spent 5 years studying urban development and community health in Greater Boston. So if any of you have done work in Dorchester, you've probably had the privilege of working with my collaborator, BARI of Rounding the Bases, who's in this photo. Now, one of the questions that consortium members asked was, can we use mobility data to understand which communities are natural organizing partners? But that's actually a really difficult question to answer, largely because mobility data from the gold standard sources like the IRS and the American Community Survey make data publicly available only for flows between states, counties, or metros, which are all too aggregated of levels to address community level questions. Oops. And so what I use instead is a longitudinal consumer credit database. I can use the data to identify block level addresses for everybody who's getting a credit card bill, a car loan, a student loan, or any other kind of credit related service. Now, these data don't cover everybody. Of course, you just saw that in the first talk today, but researchers have validated this data source for mobility by showing that it produces similar estimates to those produced by gold standard data sources like the IRS. I'm using neighborhood definitions developed through a participatory and consensus-based process by my H&S collaborators, and in the interest of time, I won't go into detail on those. Similarly, I've only got 7 minutes, so if you're watching on YouTube, you can pause on this slide to learn more about the methods. But fundamentally, this is what the final product looks like. This is the Migration Mapper app, and you can select a neighborhood in the upper right corner. The colors indicate, in this case, for example, how many more people moved from Roxbury to a given destination than would be expected if moves were just proportional to population. And you can get these estimates for where people moved from rather than to, as well as stratified by economic advantage as proxied by their Equifax risk score. And so if you look at a different neighborhood, for example, South Boston, you can see that comparing Roxbury and South Boston, these two adjacent neighborhoods have very different sending patterns. Now, why might that be? Well, I think any astute resident of Greater Boston will tell you that an explanation will need to account for the difference in demographic makeup. So here you can see the migration mapper with, on the left, Lynn on the North Shore in teal, and on the right, Brockton in the South Shore as destinations. And what you can see is that for Lynn, several inner core suburbs, particularly Chelsea and East Boston, stand out as particularly important sending neighborhoods. And what the inset shows is that these are also the 3 neighborhoods with the largest Hispanic populations in the Greater Boston area. Now on the right, the 4 predominantly Black neighborhoods of Boston, Dorchester and Roxbury, which you saw before, as well as Mattapan and Hyde Park, are primary sending neighborhoods for Brockton, which is 40% Black. South Boston, by contrast, is no more likely to send movers to Brockton than would be expected just based on its population. And in the most recent 5-year American Community Survey, the population of South Boston was nearly 75% non-Hispanic white. Now, interviews done by my H&S collaborators show that the strength of the pull of a neighborhood is shaped by friends and family and access to social and cultural institutions, but there are, of course, also push factors, especially in the South. An interviewee in Roxbury who had grown up living with her extended family in Dorchester noted that her sister had moved to Brockton, her cousins to Holbrook, her parents to Randolph, and then further south. Quote, "It's a mass exodus to the South where it's cheaper," she said. Now, this is perhaps particularly concerning in light of the July 1st Boston Globe article on real estate and rental discrimination. But notably, the respondent in Everett said something similar, quote, "We're going to be moving further and further and further from the city to afford living in a nice home." Now, it's important to note that I'm talking about Brockton and Lynn in this webinar about, quote, the two Bostons, but both are outside of the city's limits. And the reality is that even as housing and health challenges spill across city boundaries, people who've left Boston can have less of a political voice. And so for the last piece of work here, what I did was I applied a community detection algorithm to the mobility estimates that underlie the migration mapper. So the colors here identify 7 sets of geographies that emerge as highly connected. And some of you will have recognized, I think, these dark gray boundaries. These are the boundaries of the 13 Massachusetts regional planning agencies. Now, empirically detected communities and RPAs mostly overlap, but what you can see here is that there might be a need to revisit the RPA boundaries for Greater Boston. So we just saw that a lot of people are leaving Boston for Brockton, but Brockton's actually a different regional planning agency. And so people who are moving to a place where they are then maybe no longer included in transportation planning allocations, even though they might continue to work in Boston. Notably, though, that first map is constructed just using data for people with prime Equifax risk scores. And so on the right, you can see that the moves of socioeconomically disadvantaged movers around Boston are characterized by geographically differentiated and smaller subregions. I've been thinking, like everybody, about what my research has to say in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. And using this basic approach, but actually with Esteban's data rather than mine, might be a way to empirically identify sets of communities that need to coordinate their stay-at-home orders. But if mobility regions differ across groups, their strict enforcement could reinforce familiar axes of disadvantage. And the other piece of this work that I want to highlight is that this was the product of a community-engaged research collaboration, which is still quite rare when it comes to work with restricted use microdata. But it's particularly important when it comes to the use of consumer credit data. So asked about the biggest challenge facing his neighborhood, a Dorchester resident said, quote, "A lot of companies own buildings now, and they'll go to a place like Dorchester and you'll see the coded language. There will be excellent credit and references required. Okay, that's wonderful for a Fenway. Why are you here? You don't want nobody from this neighborhood to live here." That's what you're saying. And I'm not saying everybody from Dorchester has bad credit, but I'm telling you now, as a Black man, it's difficult to keep it. So asked about the biggest challenge facing his neighborhood, this resident highlighted the role credit data has played and continues to play as a tool for discrimination. So I'm not using just any old product of surveillance capitalism, but data from consumer credit, which has a long history of extractive and racist use. And so I think it's particularly pressing to develop research approaches that allow more people more agency in how and for whom these data are used. And so I'm immensely grateful to the members of the H&S Consortium who determined the research priorities, worked through methodological questions like the choice of neighborhoods, and put a great deal of time and continue to put time into interpreting the results and improving the app. So I'm also grateful to my funders, but views are my own. Thank you.
Thank you all. Now, based on the data research that you've done and the analysis that you've done, could each of you briefly describe one policy recommendation that you would make to address the issues of racial and social inequality in Boston? Who wants to start? Esteban?
Yeah, well, let me go first. Thank you. Well, I think it's I mean, we've been talking with people which are close to policymakers about the use of this data and the use of the insights that we get from this data. And so one of the things that actually we are doing in, I have to say, in another country actually, because we have the data also for another country, is try to build recommendations and to try to do policies which encourage people to actually be more explorer, in the sense that they have to be more, or to the governments to create those exploration places in which people get together. So we have seen that, for example, in the United States, but also in countries like Mexico and Australia, which we are working, there are places that work between communities, the places that get people together. And the question is whether we can replicate those places in other communities and other areas in which that actually suffer much more desegregation. So coming back to my original point in the talk is that maybe it's not about building another park, but getting people together in another different type of venue.
Jason?
Sure. I mean, that's an enormous question. And I think sort of taking the work that I've been doing at Commonwealth and the work at the city, I think we as a country need a better savings infrastructure for LMI folks and for people of color in general. What I mean by that is folks with higher incomes, more wealth have a bunch of tax advantage vehicles that the government designates for them, makes it easy for them to save, to move their money around. For lower income folks, the systems don't work, don't reach them, and cost a lot of money. So I think, I touched on banking, checking and savings accounts. I think starting there, obviously there's a range of things to do, but that strikes me as an area that's ripe for innovation, and that the way that in the way it's structured now is just unfair and unjust.
Jana?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to apologize. I'm having incredible technical difficulties right now. So I by no means consider myself a policy expert, but I think that our study really spoke to, the need for reforming the police in the context of structural racism. And I think, one thing it brings up is even if a racially biased police stop doesn't result in a violent per se sort of event like the murder of George Floyd, the continuous mental effects, that's something very important too that needs to be considered. And that should be, added into the conversation about police reform and particularly implicit bias training.
And Madeline?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And as you noted at the start of this panel, there is this, 5 months from now, and as well as now, the policy ideas that will be implemented are the ones lying around. And I have a lot of different uses for police budgets, but one that I've had in mind since last year's Boston Area Research Initiative, I saw Alicia Sasser-Modestino give a talk about her interventions with young adults in Boston improving credit scores. And these are often incredibly simple interventions, just, pay your, just don't use your credit card. Things, open a credit account in the first place, just simple things that people need help the first time they do it, but because you're not eligible for it until 18, we don't do it in the school system. And when I look at, subsidized housing around the Boston area, a lot of that requires credit checks. A lot of the things that I look at require credit checks. And so I think using some funding to implement, policies to ensure that Black and brown youth are able to qualify for the same levels of credit that white youth are getting, I think that's critically important.
So we've touched upon some very deep and intriguing issues around race and class in this area, taking a hard look at data. This is obviously a conversation that's going to carry us forward for a number of months between now and the end of the year. The bottom line for me is that we need to connect this data to policy choices and to very specific recommendations. And that's going to require a lot more discussion, both as among ourselves and those who've participated in the audience today. So I want to thank our panelists, and I want to turn this back over to Dan O'Brien for some closing comments. Dan?
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, very much for sharing your expertise today. Jason, Madeline, Esteban, Jana, and Ted, thank you for leading the way here and for both your opening comments and closing questions. I think I want to keep this brief so that everyone can go on to the rest of their Friday evening and their weekend. But I think that Ted has hit on a really important point here, right? It's one thing to look to the research and the concepts of the past. And it's another thing to be very open-eyed about the future that is before us and what comes next, depending on what agenda is in the White House in, well, 6 months, as I look at the calendar here. And also just locally, right? There was a conversation about a month and a half ago where we had a panel with Paul Grogan from the Boston Foundation, where he said that he's actually reasonably optimistic on these fronts when he thinks back to what Boston looked like 20, 30, 40 years ago. So there's that, but at the same time, we can't be overly heartened by any of that. we have to realize that there's more to do. And so I think that, right, we as a research policy community, we have a call to arms here. There's things for us to do. There's information for us to uncover. There's suggestions for us to make. And I really appreciate the speakers taking the time today to say, hey, these are the policy recommendations I'd make right now. And hopefully this community continues. And next year we're having a similar conversation where 4, if not 14 or 40 speakers who have done great work in research and policy using data have really important and trenchant recommendations to make for the next round. So that is my hope for us as a community and for this event moving forward. And I thank everyone for taking the time to share their expertise today. Again, Ted for leading us through, and to all the attendees. Obviously, this doesn't happen without you all. So with that, we look forward to seeing you all next week at our last topical panel on pollution. And I hope everyone has a great weekend, and we will see you then. Thank you, everybody.